Now, earlier I spoke with sports writer and athletics journalist Allan Darren Kyeyune on the IOC president's recent visit to Africa. He joined me from the Ugandan city of Mbale, and I began by asking him what will be the enduring legacy of Thomas Bach in Africa when he leaves office next year.
Well, I think after a 12-year spell at the helm of the International Olympic Committee, this is something that he's tried to dedicate to the continent. One, right at the very end of his career, to choose to visit the continent and not only move to just Senegal, that is set to host the 2026 World Youth Olympic Games that will be held in Dakar, but also being able to move down to the south in South Africa, Lesotho, Uganda, as well as Kenya, will remain a part of his legacy, because in Uganda, he's only the second International Olympic Committee president to visit the country after his predecessor, Jacques Robes, who visited the country just before. But to have that as part of his legacy, but more importantly, to be able to increase the incomes for the National Olympic Committees in terms of the Olympic Solidarity Program, much more further, and more importantly, the Olympic Refugee Foundation that he eventually started in 2016, where in big part, majority of the competitors through the refugee athletes Olympic team have come from Africa.
Right, and speaking of the refugee team, it is, of course, one of his most enduring projects. They do, of course, train here in East Africa. Would you say that their participation in the past 3 Olympic Games has maybe helped in efforts to combat conflict here in the Horn of Africa?
I think it's grown slowly. Even if the world is moving pretty fast, I think Africa, in a great way, has been impacted by conflict in different parts of this continent. And one of the major challenges has been the fact that when many turn to refugees, they lose their lives. They lose them entirely because they're not as comfortable as they would have been at home. And more in part, the Horn of Africa. If you notice, even countries close to the Horn of Africa, like South Sudan, and even Sudan now, which is suffering with conflict right from 2023, they've been impacted. And right from 2016, when the Olympic Refugee Foundation was started to try and help refugees rediscover themselves through the power of sport, that the numbers have grown from 10 at the 2016 Olympic Games to 29 at the 2020 Tokyo Games, which were held in 2021 in Japan. And then just recently, the numbers grew to 37, of course, having quite big numbers that came through from Iran. But of course, it's still significant contribution from the refugee athletes that have come through from South Sudan. Many of them either training in camps in Kenya as well as Uganda, I think is of great significance. And perhaps it still pushes a message, because some of the stories and narratives that we've seen through, like from Cindy Gamba, the only refugee Olympic athlete who is able to win an Olympic medal just recently in Paris through the boxing, born in Cameroon, but still being nurtured now through Great Britain. I think those stories that do come through perhaps push a significant message to some of the leaders on the continent and globally.
Right, and Thomas Bach did, of course, announce a 10% increase in funding for national Olympic committees as a parting gift. Do you think that this will probably lead to more NOCs participating and medals coming to African countries in the future?
Majority of the structures in Africa in terms of sport do struggle with funding. And one of the major challenges that athletes face, especially through individual sports, is that they've got to fend for themselves. And particularly if you look at a sport like badminton, where athletes have got to fly out of their home countries to try and collect points to be able to qualify for major championships like the Olympics. The Olympic Solidarity Fund comes in handy, or even if it's athletics, because in Uganda here we have athletes either through athletics or boxing, badminton, weightlifting, several individual disciplines where they've got to rely on the Olympic Solidarity Program of funding for them to be able to remain at the top level, to be able to compete favorably, to be able to hit the grades that they desire in terms of nutrition or even coaching, or even travel across the globe to be able to match the international standards. And that is where some of the medals have come from for some of these countries. We have some of the Olympic medalists for the country, like Joshua Cheptegei, Jacob Kiplimo, Halima Nakai, Peruth Chemtai, the Olympians who have consistently been at the last 3 Olympic Games right from Rio 2016, all go through this solidarity funding. And I think with the increment in terms of the monies, I think it comes at a great deal for Africa that still struggles with structures and infrastructure right through governance, but more importantly, the funding itself, the direct one.
Right, and finally, the race is, of course, on to succeed Thomas Bach as IOC chief next year. Very quickly, Darren, what chances do you think Zimbabwe's Kirsty Coventry, former retired swimmer, obviously, has to become the first African head of the IOC?
Well, I must say it's a tough race after 7 names were announced back in September, after Thomas Bach announced that he would not renew or extend his term of office at the helm of the IOC. And of course, her name came to the list, perhaps in great surprise to many. Born in 1983, at the age of around 41, many think that she's still got a little bit of time ahead of her. That's the first thing. But then more importantly, there is talk to try change some of the statutes in the IOC charter, as well as at the helm, to try and change that leadership code from perhaps a 2-time renewable term of office, because you get a term of office the first 8 years, then you're able to renew once. So some want to change that, and there is hope that because she's younger, she could have time a little ahead of her, and that's why many have thought that actually it could be Lord Sebastian Coe, the president of World Athletics, who could be in pole position to win this presidency and take over from Thomas Bach when the IOC voting session comes later on at the conference in Greece in March 2025. We wait to see if she stands a chance. Of course, Africa has got quite a number that could be able to be in position to vote her. But being the fact that she's an IOC member until the age of 70, which will come around 2053, she's still got time ahead of her, but she's ready to serve, I must say.